Guys? What the hell? Why did you— I've been tricked, bamboozled, put through the ringer. Why have I been lied to for my entire life? When I first played through the Arkham games on PS3, Arkham Origins was already out, and everyone told me not to play it. The internet was ablaze with Arkham Origins sucks, and it's a filthy cash grab, and it's a disgrace to the franchise, and as a dumb 13-year-old whose opinions were shaped almost entirely around other people's opinions, I believed you, and I went about my life thinking Arkham Origins sucked. But it turns out that you were all lying through your teeth, because if everyone hates Arkham Origins, then what the hell is this? Looking at the reviews on this game now, I started feeling like maybe I had imagined the hate towards Arkham Origins and it was actually a well-liked game, but I was quickly assured by forums from the time, people referencing the hatred of the game in recent articles, and the people around me that no, on release this game was panned and deemed not worth your time and not worthy of the Arkham name. And most people who never gave it a chance after that believed from then onwards that Arkham Origins is a bad game, which is weird to me, because it's better than Arkham Asylum. Whoa, oh, ow, okay, hey, calm down, let me— ow, what the hell? Listen, okay, I will explain myself in due time, but for right now, I'll say that I think my feelings have a lot to do with a lack of nostalgia and when exactly I played both of these games. I didn't play Arkham Asylum when it first came out because when it released, I was 9 years old and the T for teen actually meant something in my household, plus I didn't have a console to play it on because I only had a Wii back then. When I finally got a PS3 at 13, I was excited to play a bunch of games that my cousin had game shared me, which were all rated T for teen. And the sense of elation I got hearing someone say a swear word and knowing I was old enough to hear it was unmatched, although in the case of the Arkham games, that elation instantly turned into abject horror and fear for my life because I was really worried my mom would walk in on me playing this game while Poison Ivy was on screen. Seriously, these games turned into softcore porn whenever a female character was on screen. Why did all of them need to show off their massive honkers? The game's not called Batman Arkham Cleavage. There are some horny motherfuckers working at Rocksteady. You guys gotta keep it in your pants. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, I played Arkham Asylum 4 years after it came out, and I played City right after, and the biggest thing that I remember about Asylum was that it wasn't as good as City. It had a really cool atmosphere, to be fair. It took from one of the best Batman comics and did a decent job making you feel like you were trapped in an insane asylum with Batman's greatest foes. But City just had so many more ideas, and it played so much better, and it looked so much better, and it had Panic at the Disco on the soundtrack, which confuses me, but I'm not gonna say that's not a positive. Honestly, I think that Arkham Asylum is given props for being good at a point in time where it seemed like licensed superhero games were putting out one good game for every 100 bad games. And also for refining a somewhat existing combat system to the point that it basically created a subgenre in and of itself. And that's cool and all, but it was also immediately outclassed by every other game in that genre. It serves as an important hallmark moment in the history of video games, but as a game itself, it was feeling very dated even 4 years after its release, which was when I played it. I'm not trying to flame anyone who thinks Asylum is the best game in the series, but to me, I just feel like this thing had a very quick expiry date compared to the rest of the entries in the franchise. City is still a fun game to play now, even after Knight, and also after the Spider-Man and Mordor games improved on the combat from these titles. But I basically can't play Asylum anymore. I keep trying to, and I keep giving up because I'm just not having much fun. I was convinced that Origins was gonna fall into the Asylum camp. The way that people said they messed up the combat and how they were talking about how difficult it was to handle Batman and the bad story to boot, I thought that it was just gonna be another one of those titles that feels like it's aged horribly and lost all of the enjoyment that it may have had when it first released. Which I honestly think is more common for superhero games than most other games out there. Still, I was curious about Origins because I basically had an opinion on it without playing it, which seemed weird, so I gave it a shot last week, and I'm convinced that everyone who complained at launch was given a different game than I was. We're gonna get to the whole Arkham City 1.5 complaint later in this video, but since the games are so alike, especially in gameplay, Origins has aged just as well as City has, perhaps even better because its boss design doesn't feel quite as old. The conversation around this game made it seem like it controlled horribly and the combat was a step backwards, but I actually felt the free flow combat was as fluid as it's ever been. Some people don't like when Batman controls like a gymnast since he shouldn't have that flexibility or speed given the bulky suit, but I think Origins balances out having Batman's attacks be really powerful while also having him cover crazy distances to keep up his combo. In Asylum, I feel like the game could get away with Batman not being as agile because most of it took place in confined spaces with less goons. But as the games went bigger and broader, it became imperative to be able to have B-Man zip through the battlefield like nobody's business, and Origins makes sure the free flow combat doesn't have the jank that it can sometimes be privy to. Both Batman and the enemies in this game seem faster and more out for blood, and that gives the combat a much quicker feel feel to it. And while Arkham City and Arkham Asylum had some great animations, this game also has its fair share of awesome finishers or transition attacks when you're going from one enemy to the next. I also wish that the few new enemy types in this game were adopted by Rocksteady in Knight, especially the dudes who were able to counter Batman's own attacks. It added a whole other layer to the combat and gave it some extra depth. These games can feel a little bit easy at times, and it was a nice change of pace. There are also a couple new gadgets here and there, and a few small improvements. Overall, I just feel like the combat feels as great as it ever has. It feels brutal and slick here, and while it's only a small improvement from City, I do think it's an improvement nonetheless. I also feel like Batman, while he's running around, feels really good to control. Again, it sacrifices his weightiness a little bit, but I always found the Rocksteady games sometimes made him too hunky feeling for his own good when he was on ground. A major concern for me going into this game was how Batman would control on rooftops and platforming sections, since I saw some footage of Origins before buying it, and the traversal just looked like it was in a rough state. Batman always looked like he was flying too low, and the speed of movement left a lot to be desired. So seeing that, I was like, oh okay, this is what people were probably talking about when they said that it played badly. And it had me worried because I think Asylum handles very poorly when you're running around. It's like an ordeal to get places in that game, so I assumed that if people were mad about this, then maybe Batman had gone from handling like a sack of beans in Arkham Asylum to handling like a bloated corpse that's been rotting for a week in Arkham Origins. Which I guess isn't necessarily worse, it's just a different form of terrible. But it turns out the traversal doesn't feel all that different from City, which I replayed just before I played Origins. There's one thing that I prefer in Origins and one thing that I think it drops the ball with here. The thing that I like is that the grab no boost is available from minute 1. You have it instantly. And thank God for that, because the grab no boost basically turns a couple of promising mechanics into some of the best traversal ever made. I mean, Arkham Knight still feels so fantastic to play just gliding around. It's not perfect in these games yet, but the grab no boost is an essential tool, and I'm very happy that it's just given to us immediately, even if it doesn't make sense in the lore. What I don't like is that your downwards trajectory feels like a plane that's run out of fuel. If you dive bomb and come back up, it feels really good until you level out and start making your slow decline. In the other games, they were able to make this feel like a majestic descent, whereas here it feels like Batman whipped out his handy dandy bat depression from his utility belt and you fly around seeming kinda mopey and pathetic. And I think the reason for that is as simple as how Batman's posture and cape look in this game when he's flying around, which really goes to show just how much of a difference the smallest of changes can make. Your shoulders seem kinda slouched over, and the cape doesn't feel like it's reacting as a whole to the wind beneath you. You get the flapping, sure, but the edges of the cape seem rounded down too much, and it feels wrong. It doesn't seem like it's moving the right way, and it gives the gliding a bit of a static feel to it. Plus, the city around you is built in a way that makes it way less easy to gain speed and height, and instead you're just clanging into every building in the area, so it doesn't feel as great as it did in City, to be fair. But overall, while the traversal is a tad worse here than it is in City, I care less playing it in 2021 because they're nothing compared to Knight. So to me, the traversal in these two games is almost interchangeable. Their differences are way less apparent than they would have been back then. Kinda to hop on the last point a bit, I think my overall least favorite thing about this game was the city itself. I already mentioned how I wasn't a fan of the layout of it all because it made moving around a chore, but I also think that the city looks kinda poopy. The Rocksteady game slowly got better at understanding how to make everything way more dark and black, while also making sure the game didn't look like it constantly had the brightness too low. They used reflections in the moonlight and very carefully placed lights in the city below to make everything visible, but also allow themselves to have that midnight black look. Everything is so sleek and dark in City, and especially in Knight, and it looks incredible. But here it feels like the city is less black and more of a dull, dark gray color. It feels washed out, sad, and despondent. And yes, Gotham is supposed to look beaten down and like a city that has no hope, but in a way that feels dark and moody, not run down and unimpressive. Aside from the city though, I'm a really big fan of the rest of the presentation in this game. Although the pre-rendered cutscenes don't mesh super well with the gameplay, they're still pretty damn cinematic. There's no denying that. Honestly, this might be my personal favorite Batsuit out of all the Arkham games. I'm not really a fan of any costume that's like one of those gray spandex things. I much prefer the more hunky, almost metallic look. The earlier games Batsuits always look dorky, and most of them make Batman look like he's wearing his underwear outside of his costume. And the one from Knight is really cool, but this one feels more classic and less techy to me. I also really love a lot of the enemy designs. They feel very carefully crafted, and they have their own unique look to them that's separate from the mainline Arkham games, and that makes fights with these characters even more enjoyable than they would have been. I love the introduction of the assassins close to the opening. It feels like a big test for Batman early on in his career, and I like how Alfred and Batman have this exchange.
Those assassins will all fail their mandate if you'd just spend the evening here. They'll put innocents in danger to attract my attention. I can't take that risk.
I don't know, it feels like a good way to address why Bruce is seeking these people out instead of not being Batman so that they can't find Batman. And one thing that I really love about this game, and one of the biggest ways it's different from the main trilogy, is the type of Batman we get here. Different interpretations of Batman exist, just like the vastly different interpretations of the Joker over the years, and the Batman that we see from the Rocksteady games is clearly one with experience under his belts. He's not impatient, he's got most of this down to a science, he seems in control most of the time even when he's not, but also, and I might get a bit of heat for this, that means that he doesn't have the most interesting personality. The Batman we see from the Rocksteady games feels very adjacent to the one that we get in the Nolan trilogy. They're both within the same realm of interpretation, and one thing that people always complain about in the Nolan trilogy, as beloved as it is that Batman can be a bit one note at times, and I'd say that twofold for the Arkham games. Even when something tragic happens, I just never felt the impact of it because Batman feels like a blank slate in these games oftentimes. I don't know if I'm the only one who feels like that, but I think that's why I usually gravitate to stories about old Batman or young Batman as opposed to in-between Batman. And it's not surprising that a lot of the best stories for this character take place in the alpha or omega of his career. Arkham Origins, as per the name, follows Bruce when he's still in the very early stages of being Batman. You know, that point in time where some people aren't even sure if he's real or just a myth. The game conveys his impatience and harboring of rage in this time period pretty well, especially through its cutscenes and voice acting. Like, take the interrogation scenes for example. In most Arkham games, it's a pretty standard walk up to the guy, grab him, say, talk. And then the guy will basically instantly flip on whoever he's working for and Batman's gonna say, good, now you get special nighty-night sleepy time, and then decks him in the face and we're good. But here we get to see more of Batman's actual anger and how he came to make a name for himself being feared. He has Croc on this broken railing, and the way that he's talking and hitting the railing to drop it further and further while snarling at his opponent feels way more intense and hard-nosed than anything we see at any point in the main trilogy. And likewise, this scene with Loose Lips, I like how he starts to interrogate him like he tends to do later in his life, but he doesn't have a feel for it yet, and he accidentally knocks the dude unconscious and realizes his mistake. He uses it to his advantage though and starts doing the classic Batman dangle interrogation, and I think this is supposed to be canonically the first time he ever does this. And the game lets you see Batman as a bit more terrifying than he is in the other games. Loose Lips is screaming at the sight of him, and we get a glimpse of how it would be hanging upside down looking up at the dark figure of Batman. And it's all capped off by a nice classic fake out drop and then an actual drop onto a Christmas tree. This Batman is more brutal and seems to be taking his anger out on criminals, and because of that, I felt like I was playing a unique experience that the other games hadn't given me, even if most of the building blocks are the same. And while we're at it, I know that it's not Kevin Conroy as Batman or Mark Hamill as Joker, and that's a bummer, but don't act like Roger Craig Smith and Troy Baker didn't give us great performances. I actually think that Smith's voice works perfectly for a younger and more spiteful Batman, and I don't think you could pull a bad performance out of Troy Baker. I don't see why the game should be chastised for not having the voices that we're more accustomed to when the ones we're getting are doing an incredible job. I guess all this talk about the voice acting and character work segues us nicely into talking about the story, and this is another thing that just confuses me about the criticisms that this game got. I think the story here is just as good as any of the other Arkham games. Every single entry in this franchise has a story that's a bit of a wild goose chase. It's just a matter of what degree the game is doing this, and I'd argue that City actually does this the worst. My complaints about Origins story are that the Firefly section felt very out of place and like it was just there to pad out the game time of the main story. It wasn't a horrible section by any means, but it did fit weirdly into the overall narrative. And I do get that, especially after City, people were hoping to get a story that didn't have the Joker in it, and I also would have liked if the spotlight was instead given to Batman's other villains. But also, the Joker that we get here is pretty great. He's got like a lot more energy than we usually see from him, and that's saying a lot. It's not just pure creep factor, he's kind of springy and expressive, and it's a great fit for a younger version of the character. Obviously, he has a lot of that stuff going on later on as well, but this feels like the most energetic Joker that we've gotten. And we even get his first meeting with Harley Quinn and some great Joker origin visuals mixed with how he perceives Batman. Origins also did the whole play a brief section as Joker before Knight did it, and although Knight is my favorite Arkham game, I will say that its inclusion of the Joker is more of a sin than his inclusion here. Not because he's bad in that game either, and I like how he's incorporated, but if people were excited about the Joker's death in City and the fact that the stories that these games were telling would expand past that character going forward, shouldn't they be more upset that he's in the sequel rather than the prequel? I don't know, I just think that he was done really well here, and so I don't think that's a negative in this game at all. I may not be a fan of the jarring difference between the pre-rendered cutscenes and the gameplay since it wasn't future-proofed, but damn it if the actual direction and cinematography of this game in those cutscenes isn't brilliant. It feels like a Batman movie that you're going into and playing certain sections of. The choreography, acting, and character models, it all looks incredible even with the 720p bottleneck. And I think the way that this story was delivered and the grandeur of the story sections separate it from the Rocksteady games as its own separate thing. I really like the things that make this game different. It feels like someone else's interpretation on the Arkham games, and while they didn't have the eye for innovation that Rocksteady did, the game still felt just as good and it had its own unique flair. The story is full of amazing moments, the best of which really use this game's grasp on young Batman's emotionality to its advantage. I mentioned the more ruthless interrogations, but you also have Batman and Gordon's more spiteful dynamic. You have a fantastic exchange between Bruce and Alfred, which really highlights a relationship that's often overlooked in the Bat world. You have this great scene following Bane's destruction of the Batcave where Bruce seems genuinely worried about Alfred and you can hear it in his voice. And it reminds you that he's not used to this yet and he is human and he will have moments early on where his emotions are written on his sleeve. There's just so many great moments in this game, but also, to be fair, you get no hanky-panky scenes, so 0 out of 10, it's a bad game. Honestly, even though this might be an unpopular opinion, I love the story. I feel like aside from the Firefly section, it's more focused than the other games. It's got great emotional and action moments. There's great performances all around, and seeing stuff like Bane go big mode for the first time, or Joker realizing what Batman's code is and using it to his advantage is just fun to see, okay? Sue me. I would talk about the bosses, but I feel like everyone's aware that that was the quote-unquote one good thing about Arkham Origins, and while I clearly strongly disagree with that sentiment, because everyone's already on the same page with the bosses, I don't want to touch on it too much, but what I do want to address is the Arkham City 1.5 of it all. While I can sit here and talk about how in retrospect this game is baller as hell, I also sort of understand why people were mad at the game on release. Whenever an entry in a beloved franchise is being helmed by a team that's different from the original, it's gonna catch some heat. And there's a bit of a catch-22 that comes with it all, where if you change too much, people will get mad that you've butchered what made the games great, and if you change too little, people will say that the game is a cash grab. And while I think that WB Montreal did try its best to strike a middle ground by changing everything except the gameplay too much, it did swing a little bit to the side of not changing enough, and it has this reputation for being a lazy attempt to pimp out a good franchise. And gameplay-wise, it's hard to push back on that too much. The free-flow combat is mainly lifted from City with a very small amount of new enemy types, animations, and gadgets. Though to its credit, there are a few fun additions here for sure. The boss fights also occasionally took more than inspirations from previous games as well. They didn't go for any particularly interesting imagery or unique gameplay sections other than Firefly in the main game because the Mad Hatter stuff is pretty cool. And the copied traversal mechanics as well as part of the map being the same told a story of a game that was playing it way too safe. In some ways, it feels like an absolutely massive DLC for Arkham City. But to call this lazy or uninspired or a cash grab seems awfully dismissive to the work that was put into this. A lazy game would have recycled the exact same map instead of overhauling, expanding, and changing it. A lazy game wouldn't have added any of those changes that it did to the combat and gadgets. A lazy game wouldn't have worked so hard to create such a cinematic presentation or flesh out new character dynamics or old ones in a fresh light. A lazy game wouldn't have given us fresh new looks for all of the major characters. A lazy game wouldn't have created wholly unique combat animations, and plenty of them, to differentiate a character's personality in a section that only lasts a minute. A lazy game wouldn't have tried to make mechanically complex bosses, and the lazy game would not have stayed this consistent with its characterization and tone and attitude. If Arkham Origins is a DLC for Arkham City, then it's the best damn DLC ever made. Okay, aside from these ones, but you understand what I'm saying. It's really interesting to note how much people's enjoyment of a game can come from the time and situation that was going on when that game was made. Just like how marketing can change how people view a game, coming fresh off the heels of one thing to be met with something that follows it up to be not quite how you expected, it can completely transform how you look at a game. Metal Gear Solid 2 was hated on release because of the ballsy moves that it made, and now a lot of people consider it to be the best one in the franchise. Playing Arkham Origins in 2021 without the baggage it originally had of being a follow-up to City has me view Origins as not just worthy of this franchise, but better than the game that started it all. And while I'm sure that people will still be mad to a degree about that take, I don't really care because Arkham Origins might just be the best game that everyone hates. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you did, leave a like or let me know in the comments what I could improve on. If you know a good place to share the video, that would be a massive help. But honestly, even if you just watched this far, I appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.